480 BCE. You are standing behind stone walls that hold the heat of the day long after the sun has set. The air is still, too still. You hear fabric shift somewhere behind you, the quiet movement of people trained not to be heard. Footsteps pass, measured, deliberate, never rushed. You do not turn. Turning is not permitted. You wait, because waiting is what you have learned to do. You are not a prisoner, not officially. You are royalty, a woman of the Persian court. Your name is known, but it is spoken less each year. What remains is your position, your usefulness, and the silence that surrounds you. Oil lamps flicker along the corridor, their light never fully reaching the corners. Shadows stretch and withdraw as servants move past, eyes lowered, expressions carefully empty. You can hear your own breath. You slow it. Even that feels watched. You have already learned the most important lesson of this place. Nothing happens suddenly. Nothing is done in anger. What comes next will not be loud. It will be decided calmly, recorded neatly, and executed without hesitation. You stand within the Achaemenid Empire at the height of its power. From the Aegean coast to the Indus Valley, the world bends toward Persepolis. Roads stretch farther than memory. Orders travel faster than rumor. The empire prides itself on balance, law, and order. And within that order, there is a place for you. It is not the place you were promised. You were raised to believe proximity to power meant protection, that royal blood insulated you from the harsher realities faced by others, that the empire's famed tolerance extended inward into the walls of the palace itself. That belief does not survive long here, because behind the relief carvings and gold-adorned halls, there exists another structure, one that does not announce itself. One that leaves no monuments, a system designed not to destroy women openly, but to contain them, to reshape them, to remove their threat without drawing attention. This is not a moment of chaos. This is routine. What you are experiencing has happened before. It will happen again. The men who designed it understand something essential about power. Killing creates memory. Silence creates stability. And so the Persian court perfected a different method. This was not random cruelty. It was policy. The empire functioned through records.
Clay tablets, seals, lists of rations, movements, permissions. Every individual mattered only insofar as they could be categorized. Royal women were no exception. Their lives were logged not as stories, but as variables. Daughters were alliances. Wives were guarantees. Mothers were potential liabilities. Love did not enter the calculation. Neither did mercy. What mattered was continuity. The Persian king ruled as the axis of the world, chosen by divine favor, supported by an elite bureaucracy that understood the danger of disorder. Royal women lived closest to the center, and therefore under the greatest scrutiny.
Their movements were controlled. Their speech was monitored. Their influence was tolerated only when it served a purpose. This was how stability was maintained. The royal household was not a family. It was an institution. Women of the court lived behind walls, not for protection, but for management. Eunuchs acted as intermediaries, not merely guards, but administrators of access. Who could be seen, who could speak, who could be remembered. From the outside, later historians would describe luxury: gold-threaded garments, perfumed halls, servants in abundance. What was not written down was the cost of that containment. Every privilege came with restriction. every comfort with surveillance. A woman who understood the court too well became dangerous. A woman who formed alliances of her own became suspect. A woman who remembered too much could not be allowed to speak freely. And so the system responded, not with chains, with distance, not with execution, with erasure. The Persian Empire did not need public punishment to enforce obedience among royal women. It relied on something more effective: isolation, reinforced by inevitability. Decisions were framed as necessity. Outcomes were described as unfortunate but required. Responsibility dissolved into procedure. No one individual was ever to blame. That is how the system protected itself. Within palace records, women appear briefly and then vanish. A marriage is noted, a birth recorded, a ration allocation reduced, a transfer to another residence approved. Then nothing, no scandal, no explanation, just absence. What history records is efficiency. What it does not teach is what that efficiency cost. Some royal women were moved far from court under the justification of tradition or health.
Others were confined into inner quarters, their presence gradually minimized until even servants spoke their names less often. A few were compelled into religious roles where silence was sanctified and withdrawal praised as virtue. None of this was described as punishment. It did not need to be, because the fear did not come from pain. It came from uncertainty. You never knew which word would be your last, which conversation would be misinterpreted, which expression would be remembered incorrectly. The rules were unwritten by design. Clarity creates resistance.
Ambiguity creates compliance. This is how the empire ruled its own blood. If you want to understand how power survives without constant force, this is where you look. Not at the battlefield, at the household. Not at the enemy, at the woman who knows too much. This is why stories like these exist on Dark Inquest history. Not to dramatize the past, but to examine the systems that operated quietly, leaving no ruins to warn us. The Persian kings understood something enduring. Authority does not need to break everyone. It only needs to make examples disappear.
Royal women learned to speak carefully, to listen more than they answered, to wait. Waiting became a survival skill. Days passed without instruction, weeks without summons. Silence itself became a message, and in that silence, fear settled. Consider Atasa, daughter of Cyrus the Great, wife of Darius I. History remembers her as influential, respected, present. What it does not fully record are the constraints under which that influence existed. Her power was real, but conditional. It depended on alignment with the throne, on restraint, on knowing when not to act.
For every Atosa preserved in the record, there were others whose names were not carried forward. Women whose influence was curtailed before it could be acknowledged. Women whose loyalty was assumed but never trusted. The system did not require rebellion to react. It reacted to potential. And potential, once identified, was neutralized quietly. There were no trials, no public accusations. The Persian court did not air its internal conflicts. It absorbed them. A woman removed from proximity to the king ceased to exist politically. Her voice carried no weight.
Her children's prospects shifted. Her supporters recalculated. The removal was complete long before death ever arrived. In many cases, death never did. Survival was the sentence. To live without influence, to exist without recognition, to remain present but irrelevant. This was considered a humane solution. From the empire's perspective, it was efficient. From the woman's perspective, it was total. What they don't teach is how normalized this became, how servants adjusted, how how officials stopped asking questions, how silence turned into routine. The Persian Empire prided itself on justice,
on respecting local customs, on ruling through law rather than terror. And in many ways, that reputation was earned. But justice, when applied selectively, becomes another form of control. Royal women were bound by expectations they did not design. Their obedience was assumed, their ambition treated as deviation, their suffering framed as unfortunate necessity. And because it happened behind walls, it did not threaten the empire's image. This is what was buried in the archives, not erased by time, but by design. As you stand there, in that imagined corridor, you begin to understand something else.
There will be no dramatic end, no final confrontation, no moment of release. What follows will be long, measured, quiet. And as the lamps dim and footsteps fade, one thought becomes impossible to escape. Death would have been easier than what followed. The corridors did not change, but your place within them did. You were still present, still accounted for, still breathing the same air. Yet something subtle had shifted. Invitations stopped arriving. Conversations shortened. Faces that once acknowledged you now passed without recognition. No decree announced this change.
No messenger explained it. The system did not need to speak aloud to be understood. This was how the Persian court disciplined without punishment. Inside the empire's inner world, power was not expressed through sudden action. It moved gradually through reduction. Less access, fewer choices, narrower corridors of possibility. The result was the same, but without disruption. The women of the royal household learned to recognize these signs early. They were trained, informally but thoroughly, to read absence. A servant reassigned, a chamber sealed, a name no longer spoken during council meals.
These were warnings, not accidents. The Persian administrative mind valued order above all else. Disorder invited challenge. Challenge invited instability. And instability threatened the king's divine mandate. Anything that hinted at internal fracture had to be managed before it became visible. Royal women existed at the fault line of that risk. They carried bloodlines that could legitimize or undermine succession. They influenced heirs long before those heirs reached the throne. They remembered conversations others preferred forgotten. Their proximity to the king made them powerful, but that same proximity made them dangerous.
The solution was not to destroy them. It was to make them predictable, and predictability came from containment. The court was structured to ensure that no single woman could ever operate independently. Influence was distributed, fragmented, and closely monitored. Rivalries were not discouraged, they were useful. Divided attention reduced collective power. Isolation prevented solidarity. This was not cruelty in the emotional sense, it was strategy. Records from Persepolis show allocations of goods to women whose names appear once, then never again. These were not mistakes.
They were administrative conclusions. When a woman ceased to be relevant to the empire's objectives, her support was quietly withdrawn. She was not accused. She was simply no longer necessary. In some cases, removal took the form of reassignment. A woman might be sent to a distant estate, framed as honor, a position of ceremonial significance, stripped of political access. The language used was respectful. The effect was absolute. Distance did the rest. Separated from the court, a royal woman lost her network. Information arrived late, if at all. Decisions were made without her knowledge. Her influence evaporated, not through confrontation,
but through delay. Time itself became an instrument. Others remained within the palace, but were enclosed more tightly, movement restricted to specific quarters, audiences granted only with permission that never arrived. Their world narrowed to rooms designed to be comfortable enough to discourage complaint, yet confining enough to prevent relevance. This was survival without agency. What history records is that the Persian Empire endured for centuries. What it rarely explains is how endurance was maintained internally.
Not through constant violence, but through systems that taught people to disappear quietly. Royal women were expected to accept this as duty. They were told this was order. They were told this was protection. What was not said was that their lives were being managed toward invisibility. Names like Parysatis appear in the historical record because they broke containment, because their actions forced acknowledgement. But for every woman whose influence leaked into history, dozens were absorbed without trace. Their stories were never meant to survive. Inside the palace, memory was selective.
Servants were rotated to prevent loyalty. Records were adjusted to reflect new priorities. Even mourning was regulated. Excessive grief drew attention. Attention raised questions. Questions invited scrutiny. Silence became habit. The psychological weight of this system cannot be measured in documents. It lived in the constant calculation every woman was forced to make. What to say, when to speak, when to remain unseen. Trust was dangerous. Friendship carried risk. Even motherhood did not guarantee security. A child could elevate you or replace you. And once replaced, you were expected to withdraw gracefully. This expectation was not enforced through threat. It was enforced through precedent. Women watched what happened to those who misjudged their position. They learned from absence, from the sudden emptiness left behind when someone was removed without explanation. Fear did not need to be announced. It circulated quietly. The Persian kings did not see themselves as cruel. They saw themselves as guardians of balance. From their perspective, the stability of the empire outweighed individual suffering. Royal women were not victims in this calculation. They were components, interchangeable when necessary. This is why resistance rarely took the form of rebellion. It appeared instead as adaptation. Women learned to exert influence indirectly, through trusted intermediaries, through timing rather than confrontation, through shaping heirs quietly rather than challenging authority openly. Those who succeeded did so by aligning perfectly with the system's expectations. Those who failed vanished into its margins. What wasn't written down were the long years of waiting, the days without purpose, the slow erosion of identity when your role is defined entirely by others and can be revoked without warning. Survival required compliance. Compliance required silence. And silence, over time, reshaped people. By the midpoint of the empire's history, this system was so normalized that it no longer required justification. New generations entered the court already aware of the rules. Mothers taught daughters how to endure, how to appear content, how to make themselves small when necessary. This was not submission born of weakness, it was strategy born of constraint. The darkest aspect of this structure was not what it did to individuals, but what it taught the institution.
That control could be maintained without visible harm. That order could be preserved without public cruelty. That suffering, if properly contained, left no mark on official memory. The empire learned how to rule without appearing to rule, and royal women paid the price. As the years passed, many accepted that their lives would not end in resolution. There would be no restoration, no acknowledgement, only continuation within narrower boundaries. Their existence became a waiting room without exit. This is where the system revealed its true strength, not in moments of force, but in the absence of them.
Because when nothing happens, resistance loses its shape. And by the time anyone realized what had been taken, there was no moment left to reclaim. By the time the system reached full maturity, it no longer needed enforcement. It functioned through expectation. Royal women entering the Persian court did not have to be warned explicitly. The structure educated them. From the first days, patterns revealed themselves. Who spoke freely and who did not? Who was seen and who was present but unseen? Who aged within influence and who aged within confinement? Every silence carried instruction.
The court did not demand obedience through fear alone. It cultivated anticipation. Women learned to predict consequences before action occurred. This anticipation shaped behavior more effectively than any punishment ever could. And so many complied long before they were tested. The empire's administrators understood that memory was dangerous. A woman who remembered alternatives might imagine them again. A woman who remembered her former standing might resist its loss. The system responded by narrowing memory itself. Royal women were surrounded by routines designed to dull time.
Ceremonial tasks, religious observances, controlled audiences. Their days were filled just enough to prevent emptiness, but never enough to restore purpose. Purpose was reserved for the throne. When influence was permitted, it was conditional, temporary, always revocable. A woman might be consulted during a succession crisis, then sidelined once stability returned. Her utility acknowledged only until it became inconvenient. This created a cruel paradox. The more capable a woman proved herself to be, the more closely she was watched. Competence drew attention.
Attention invited evaluation. Evaluation often led to removal, and so survival favored restraint over brilliance. What history records are moments when this containment failed, when women like Parysatis asserted themselves so forcefully that they could not be ignored. But even these stories, preserved as exceptions, obscure the rule. For every name that survived, countless others were filtered out, their lives dissolved into routine, their choices reduced to endurance. The darkest turning points were rarely dramatic. They occurred in private spaces, marked by administrative language and polite decisions.
A seal pressed into clay. A residence reassigned. A visitor denied entry. A door closed. Not slammed. Closed carefully. Once closed, it did not reopen. These moments carried no witnesses beyond those required to process them. Servants trained not to react. Officials trained not to question. The woman at the center of the decision was rarely consulted. Her consent was assumed to be irrelevant. This was the climax of the system. Not a moment of violence, but a finality. When access ended, everything else followed. Information dried up. Allies recalibrated.
The future narrowed to what could be endured rather than what could be shaped. This was where hope quietly ended. Many royal women lived on for years after this point. Their lives were not taken. Their presence was tolerated, but the trajectory was irreversible. The empire had decided their relevance was complete. They were no longer part of history's forward motion. They became still. In these moments, objects took on symbolic weight. A piece of jewelry no longer worn. A ceremonial garment folded away. A lamp extinguished earlier than usual. These were not gestures of mourning, but acknowledgments of transition.
The court did not mark these changes publicly.
There were no rituals for loss of influence, no language to describe it. To name the process would have been to admit its existence. Instead, it was absorbed into custom. What followed was a long aftermath that extended beyond individual lives. Politically, the system worked. Succession crises were contained, rival claims weakened, the throne appeared stable, the empire endured. Culturally, something else occurred. Female power became suspect by default. Influence exercised openly was seen as dangerous. Authority expressed quietly was tolerated, but only temporarily.
Ambition learned to disguise itself as obedience. This reshaped expectations across generations. Young women entering the court did not aspire to change the system. They aspired to survive it. They learned to value invisibility as safety, silence as strategy. The cost of this adaptation was internalized. History, written later, preserved the empire's achievements. Roads, laws, architecture, tolerance. It recorded kings and conquests. It mentioned royal women only when their actions could not be omitted. What it did not record was the cumulative weight of erasure. The absence of voices became normalized. The lack of testimony treated as proof that nothing significant had occurred. Silence was mistaken for consent. This distortion lingered long after the empire itself faded. When the Persian Empire fell, its administrative habits, the absence of voices became normalized. The lack of testimony treated as proof that nothing significant had occurred. Silence was mistaken for consent. This distortion lingered long after the empire itself faded. When the Persian Empire fell, its administrative habits did not vanish overnight. They were inherited, adapted, replicated. The idea that power could manage threats quietly, without spectacle, proved durable. This is why these stories matter, not because they shock, because they explain. They explain how authority learns to preserve itself, how systems refine methods that leave no scars visible enough to demand accountability.
How suffering can be rendered administrative. Halfway through this history, it becomes clear that remembering is not passive, it is an act. And continuing to remember together matters. That is why dark inquest history exists, not to condemn the past, but to examine the mechanisms that shaped it, and to keep alive the stories that were designed to fade. The women at the center of this system were not weak, they were constrained. Their silence was not chosen freely, it was produced. And once produced, it was inherited. The empire did not need to justify what it did to them.
It only needed to ensure that their stories did not circulate. Over time, even the gaps became invisible. What remains now are fragments, names without conclusions, roles without endings, lives that appear briefly, then dissolve. These gaps are not accidents. They are evidence of a system that understood the power of disappearance, that taught itself how to erase without killing, how to rule without noise. As the torches dimmed in Persepolis and the corridors emptied, the system remained intact, quiet, efficient, unchallenged, and the women it absorbed became part of the empire's foundation, present in its endurance, absent from its memory.
When the Persian Empire finally receded from history, it did not collapse in the way empires are often imagined. There was no single night when the lights went out everywhere at once. Administration continued, customs persisted, habits outlived rulers. And among those habits was the quiet management of absence. The women who had been contained by the court did not suddenly reappear when power shifted. Their stories did not rush back into the open. There were no recovered testimonies, no late confessions. Silence had done its work too well. Later chroniclers wrote of kings, wars, and decrees.
They described the empire's tolerance, its roads, its efficiency. They mentioned royal women only when unavoidable, and even then only in relation to men, mothers of heirs, wives of rulers, daughters used to mark lineage. What happened after their usefulness ended was rarely recorded, not because it was unknown, because it was understood. The system had trained everyone involved to treat disappearance as normal, to accept that some lives concluded without visible endings, to believe that stability required forgetting. This is the most enduring consequence of what the Persian Empire did to its royal women.
Not the suffering itself, but the precedent it set. A precedent that power could resolve internal threats quietly, that it could absorb human lives into procedure, that it could remove influence without producing martyrs, that it could survive by teaching people not to ask where someone went. The women at the center of this story were not remembered as victims. They were remembered, if at all, as functions that ended. Their humanity was secondary to their role, their interior lives irrelevant to the record. Yet their impact did not vanish. They shaped heirs who learned caution before courage.
They shaped courts that valued silence over debate. They shaped cultures where female authority learned to hide itself to survive. The empire's longevity was built in part on this lesson. Order can be maintained without spectacle. Control can be enforced without visible cruelty. Erasure can be more effective than execution. What history records as calm governance often rests on these unseen foundations. And when we encounter gaps in the historical record, names that fade, stories that stop without explanation, we are not looking at accidents. We are looking at the outcome of a system working exactly as intended. These women were not erased by time. They were erased by design. To remember them now is not to impose modern judgment on the past. It is to recognize patterns that repeat whenever power prioritizes stability over humanity, whenever order is valued more than voice, whenever silence is mistaken for peace. The Persian Empire no longer rules the world. Its palaces are ruins. Its kings are names in textbooks. But its methods echo. They echo wherever authority learns that disappearance leaves fewer problems than confrontation, wherever institutions manage people quietly rather than justly, wherever lives are reduced to their usefulness and discarded without record. The unease this leaves is intentional. There is no resolution to offer, no justice delivered late, no final revelation that restores what was taken. There is only memory, and memory, once restored, becomes responsibility. If these stories matter, if examining how power learned to erase without killing matters, then keeping them alive is not passive. It is an act of refusal, a refusal to let silence complete its work. That is why subscribing to Dark Inquest History is not about following a channel. It is about choosing to remember those who were meant to disappear and ensuring their stories are not buried a second time. If you want to continue this work together, what part of history should we uncover next?